I don't remember the crash, only the silence afterward. The memory of that silence feels more vivid than anything else, as if it clings to me, growing heavier the longer I think about it. I woke in a hospital bed, my body wrapped in pain and wires. Blurred faces hovered above me, murmuring words I couldn't understand. One of them, a nurse with tired eyes, leaned closer. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't survive accidents like that." Luck. Was that what it was? The first time I noticed the clocks, I thought they were hallucinations, leftover fragments from the painkillers they pumped into me. Above the nurse's head, faint but distinct, floated an old-fashioned clock face. Its brass hands ticked steadily forward, though I couldn't hear the sound. The numbers glowed faintly. 4:32:07:16. I blinked, then blinked again, but the clock didn't disappear. It hovered there, untouchable, impossible. When I glanced at the doctor standing by my bed, I saw another one, his clock ticking with a different time. 12:15:4:53. The clocks were everywhere. At first, I convinced myself it was some bizarre after effect of the accident, head trauma, some trick of the light. But even after the hospital released me, the clocks followed. Above every head on the street, in the grocery store, on the television, they ticked. The patterns were unsettling. For some, the numbers moved slowly, counting years into the future. Others, like the frail old man who walked his dog outside my apartment every morning, ticked toward a time just days away. I tried to ignore them, to live as I had before the accident. But it was impossible. Once you notice the ticking of a clock, it's all you can hear, even in silence. One morning, as I watched the old man shuffle past my window, his clock ticked its final seconds. He paused mid-step, his hand clutching his chest, and slumped to the ground. I raced outside, but there was nothing I could do. His small dog yapped frantically, circling his motionless body. It wasn't just coincidence. The truth struck me then, cold and undeniable. The clocks weren't a hallucination. They were death itself, visible only to me. And I was cursed to watch them tick. The next time I saw a clock approaching zero, I couldn't sit idly by. It was a woman at the coffee shop, sipping her latte by the window. Her clock ticked ominously. 00:00:05:21. My hands shook as I clutched my own cup, my mind racing. What could possibly happen to her in 5 minutes? When her clock reached 00:00:34, I acted on impulse. I stood abruptly, spilling coffee down my sleeve as I rushed to her table. She looked up, startled. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now," I said, my voice trembling. "What?" she asked, frowning. "Please," I insisted, my heart pounding. "You're in danger. Trust me." She hesitated, glancing toward the door, then back at me. Maybe it was the urgency in my voice, or maybe the desperation on my face, but she stood, leaving her coffee behind. We stepped outside just as it happened. A car skidded off the road, its tires screeching on wet pavement. It careened into the cafe, shattering the glass storefront. Tables overturned, chairs splintered, and chaos erupted. If she'd stayed at her table, she would have been sitting right in the car's path. She turned to me, her face pale. How did you know?" I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't stop. For weeks, I watched the clocks obsessively, stepping in whenever I could. A construction worker whose harness frayed mid-shift, a child who wandered too close to a busy street, a man who nearly slipped on an icy staircase. Each intervention left me drained but exhilarated. I was saving lives, rewriting the endings written above their heads. The more I saved, the more I felt like I was defying fate itself. But fate doesn't like to be cheated. It started small. A boy I saved from choking on a piece of candy fell from a tree the next day. The woman from the cafe broke her leg in a freak accident weeks later when her clock began ticking again. Each person whose time I altered seemed to stumble into worse misfortunes, their clocks resetting to tick faster, louder. It was as though the universe was balancing its scales, reclaiming the seconds I'd stolen. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself staring at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. For weeks, I'd been too afraid to look up and see the clock above my head. My hands trembled as I finally forced myself to glance upward. 00, 12:36:42. 12 days. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Since the accident, I hadn't thought about my own time. Now it loomed over me, counting down with cruel indifference. The clocks had turned their gaze on me. The clock above my head ticked relentlessly. Its steady countdown echoed in my mind like a drumbeat I couldn't escape. 12 days had already dwindled to 7, and with every passing second, the weight of its presence grew heavier, more oppressive. I tried to avoid looking at it, but it was impossible. Reflections betrayed me. In mirrors, store windows, the blank, dark surface of my phone screen. Even when I couldn't see it, I could feel it, ticking away my time. By the 5th day, I was desperate for answers. The thought of simply waiting, letting the clock reach 0, was unbearable. There had to be someone who could help me, someone who could explain what was happening. That's when I found him. It was in an old bookstore, one of those places you stumble into by accident but feel compelled to explore. The air smelled of dust and leather, the shelves towering and uneven. I'd come in seeking distraction, but my eyes were drawn to a strange book displayed on the counter. Chronicles of the Unseen. The title sent a shiver through me, as if it were waiting for me to notice it. I reached for the book, but before I could touch it, a hand appeared. A pale, bony hand that seemed too old to belong to someone who could still stand. "That one's not for you," the shopkeeper said. He emerged from the shadows behind the counter, his face gaunt, his eyes pale and glassy. They weren't looking at me but slightly above my head. "You see them, don't you?" His voice was a rasp, dry and brittle. For a moment I couldn't speak. My instinct was to lie, but something about the man's gaze pinned me in place. He knew. "Yes," I whispered. He nodded, his thin lips curling into a grim smile. "The clocks." I leaned in, my heart pounding. "What are they? Why can I see them? Why can't I make them stop?" The shopkeeper didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for me to follow him into a back room. The air grew colder as we walked, the dim lighting casting strange shadows on the peeling wallpaper. He led me to a table cluttered with faded papers and strange trinkets. On one corner of the table sat an old, tarnished pocket watch. Its face was blank, but its hands spun slowly, endlessly. "You're a keeper," he said, settling into a creaky chair. "What does that mean?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "Keepers are rare," he said. "Chosen, if you can call it that. You've glimpsed the veil between life and death, and now you're tethered to it. The clocks are part of that veil. They show you what others can't see." I shook my head, the explanation only raising more questions. "Why me? And why now?" The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Something happened to you, didn't it? A brush with death." The memory of the accident rushed back, sharp and vivid. I nodded. "That's when it starts," he said. "The veil touched you, but it didn't take you. Now it clings to you. The clocks, the ticking, they're reminders. You weren't supposed to escape." I sank into the chair opposite him, the weight of his words settling over me like lead. I've been trying to stop them, to save people. But every time I do, something worse happens. The shopkeeper's smile was grim. Because you're meddling with the balance. Death doesn't like to be cheated, and when you take what belongs to it, it takes something else. His words filled me with a cold dread. So what do I do? The shopkeeper's pale eyes met mine. You can't stop the clocks, but you can listen to them. There's a rhythm to death, a purpose. If you follow it, you might find a way to soften its edges. Softening edges didn't sound like much of a solution, but I didn't have a choice. As I left the shop, the old man called after me. Beware the ones that tick too fast. They're not what they seem. By the time I got home, the shopkeeper's words gnawed at my mind. What had he meant by clocks that tick too fast? I didn't have to wonder long. The next morning, I noticed a man sitting on a bench outside my building. His clock was unlike any I'd seen before. It spun backward, the numbers tumbling in reverse. -00123407. I froze, my stomach twisting in knots. I approached him cautiously. He looked ordinary enough. Gray coat, worn gloves, face lined with age. But as I drew closer, I noticed his eyes. They were blank, lifeless, as though he were staring through me. Are you... I hesitated, unsure how to finish the question. The man didn't respond, but his lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't warm, it was cold, knowing, and it sent a chill down my spine. His clock continued to spin, faster now, as if reacting to my presence. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. You can see them too, he said, his voice raspy and brittle. How do you... They watch you, he interrupted, his gaze locking onto mine. They see what you're trying to do. You're not the first. Not the first to do what? To interfere, he said. His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. But they always catch up, always. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, the air thick and suffocating. Who are you? I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. You don't belong here, he said. But you will. Before I could respond, he stood and walked away, his backward spinning clock fading into the distance. For the first time since the accident, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. My own clock ticked loudly in my mind, its relentless countdown a reminder that my time was running out. And now, I wasn't sure if I could escape it. The air felt heavier with every passing second. My clock, now at 00000117, ticked audibly in my mind. I could no longer ignore the sound, no longer pretend I had control over the unraveling threads of my life. Time was slipping through my fingers, and with it, the fragile grip I had on understanding the clocks. That night, the ticking grew louder, not just from my own clock, but from everywhere. It surrounded me, the sound of thousands of clocks overlapping into a maddening symphony. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. My own eyes looked foreign, hollowed by sleepless nights and the weight of knowledge I couldn't unlearn. And then, the ticking stopped. The silence was deafening. It pressed against my ears, more oppressive than the noise had ever been. Slowly, I turned away from the window. The room was no longer mine. I was surrounded by gray, endless, shifting shades that stretched infinitely in every direction. The walls, the furniture, even the floor beneath my feet had dissolved into a fog-like void. The only solid object was the clock hovering above my head, its numbers frozen at 000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 I spun around. The man from the bench stood before me, his backward ticking clock hanging like a halo above his head. Only now I could see him clearly. His face was a patchwork of features that didn't belong together. Eyes too large, a mouth that stretched too wide, skin that rippled as if something beneath it was struggling to escape. "Where am I?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Not where," he corrected, his tone almost amused. "When? This is the fold between seconds, where time forgets its rules. You've seen too much, interfered too often. Now the clocks have brought you here." I glanced at my own clock. The numbers hadn't moved. The hands remained still, caught in a moment that refused to pass. "What happens when it hits zero?" I asked. He smiled, his teeth gleaming like polished bone. "That's for you to decide." "I don't understand," I shouted, the fog closing in around us. "Why is this happening to me? I was trying to help." "That's the problem," he said, stepping closer. "You think you can change the rhythm without consequence, but every action ripples forward and back. You saved lives, yes, but the clocks don't measure lives, they measure balance." His words hit me like a cold wind. "And if the balance breaks? The scales tip, the ripple becomes a wave, and the wave..." He paused, his distorted face twisting into something almost sorrowful. "It consumes everything." I stared at him, my chest tightening as the weight of his words sank in. "What do I do?" I whispered. "You choose." He gestured to the fog around us. As he did, shapes began to form, ghostly images of the people whose clocks I had changed. The woman in the cafe, the boy choking on candy, the construction worker. Each of them flickered like an old film reel, their faces pale and blurred. "Return the time you stole," he said, his voice softer now. "Restore the rhythm." But how? He didn't answer. Instead, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the fog. "You already know," his voice echoed, barely audible. The fog thickened, swallowing him whole. I stood alone, the silence oppressive, my clock hovering ominously above me. The frozen numbers burned into my vision. I closed my eyes, willing myself to think, to understand. If balance was what the clocks demanded, then balance was what I had to give. The answer came, clear and undeniable. I focused on the frozen images of the lives I had altered. One by one, I envisioned their clocks resetting, their original paths restored. With every act of surrender, I felt a piece of myself unraveling, like threads being pulled from a tapestry. The weight of the decision wasn't physical, but I felt it in my core, a hollowing out, a giving up. The last image to fade was the woman from the cafe. Her clock resumed its steady countdown, ticking forward toward an end I could no longer delay. The fog around me began to recede, the gray giving way to familiar shapes and colors. I was back in my apartment. The ticking had stopped. The air was still, heavy with the finality of what I had done. For the first time in weeks, I looked up at my own clock. It was gone. But its absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it left behind a lingering silence, a reminder of what I had seen, of what I had chosen. The clocks no longer followed me, but their shadow remained. I couldn't unsee the veil or the balance it demanded. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt too still, I swore I could hear it. A faint ticking, somewhere far away, counting down the seconds of a future I could no longer change.